To escape the thunderstorm, the CEO spent the night with a beautiful stranger and discovers a shocking truth. The storm raged outside, a furious symphony of wind and rain battering the sleek glass walls of the penthouse suite. Damien Carter, the formidable CEO of Carter Enterprises, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city blur beneath the heavy downpour. He had intended to fly back to New York that evening, but the unexpected storm had grounded all flights, leaving him stranded in a city he barely knew. Frustrated but resigned, he loosened his tie and exhaled sharply. His mind was still tangled in the high-stakes negotiations from earlier that day. Business had always been his priority, his safe space. Yet tonight, as the storm howled like a wild beast, a strange sense of unease settled in his chest. With a sigh, he turned away from the window and grabbed his coat. He wasn't the kind of man to sit still and wait for circumstances to change. A drink, perhaps, would help calm his restlessness. Downstairs, the hotel's lounge was dimly lit, an elegant refuge from the storm outside. A few guests lingered, murmuring conversations blending with the soft jazz playing in the background. Damien took a seat at the bar, ordering a glass of whiskey. That was when he noticed her. She sat alone, her fingers wrapped around a glass of wine, eyes fixed on the storm outside. The dim lighting did little to hide her beauty. Dark waves of hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her features were striking yet delicate. There was something about her, a quiet mystery, an air of sadness that called to him in a way he couldn't explain. Without thinking, he found himself moving closer. "Storm's relentless tonight," he said, breaking the silence. She turned to him, her lips curving into a small smile. "Yes, it is." Her voice was smooth, carrying a hint of something, melancholy perhaps? "Damien," he introduced himself, extending a hand. She hesitated for a brief moment before placing her hand in his. "Aria." Their fingers touched, and something flickered in her gaze. Damien felt it too. An odd sensation, like a whisper of familiarity, though he was certain they had never met before. "Stuck here for the night?" he asked. She nodded. "Flights cancelled." "Same here." He took a sip of his drink, studying her. "Do you live in the city?" Aria shook her head, amusement dancing in her eyes. "And if I asked you the same question?" "I don't." "Then we're both strangers in a strange place," she said, her voice tinged with something unreadable. They talked, the conversation flowing effortlessly. He found himself drawn to her in a way that was unfamiliar, unsettling. She had a quiet strength, a guardedness that intrigued him. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The lounge emptied, but they remained, lost in conversation. Damien, who never indulged in personal talks with strangers, found himself revealing things he hadn't spoken about in years. Aria listened, her eyes warm, understanding. When the bartender announced last call, they hesitated. Neither wanted to leave. "Would you like to continue this conversation somewhere else?" Damien asked carefully. Aria studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right." They found themselves back in Damien's suite, the storm still raging outside. He poured them both another drink, and they settled by the fireplace. The air between them was charged, thick with something unspoken. Aria ran her fingers along the rim of her glass. "Tell me, Damien," she murmured, "do you believe in fate?" He raised a brow. "I believe in making my own fate." She smiled. "Of course you do." A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, almost hesitantly, she said, "What if I told you, we've met before?" Damien frowned. "I'd say I'd remember." Aria held his gaze, something flickering in the depths of her eyes. "You don't." His chest tightened. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then exhaled. "I wasn't sure at first. But now, I know who you are." Damien felt an inexplicable chill. "Who am I?" Aria leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man who changed my life, without even realizing it." A clap of thunder shook the room, but nothing could compare to the storm brewing inside Damien Carter as he stared at the woman before him, his mind racing. Who was she? And what was the truth he was about to uncover? Damien's pulse quickened. He had met countless people in his lifetime, business partners, rivals, strangers in passing. But something about Arya's words unsettled him. "The man who changed your life," he repeated, setting his glass down. "You're going to have to explain that." Arya studied him for a long moment before sighing. "I didn't expect to run into you like this. It's strange. But maybe fate has a sense of humor." Damien leaned forward. "Tell me." She exhaled sharply, as if summoning courage. 12 years ago, you made a choice. One you probably don't even remember. But it altered the course of my entire life." His brows furrowed. 12 years ago? He quickly did the math. He would have been fresh out of college, just beginning his climb in the corporate world. "What choice?" Arya's lips pressed together before she answered. "You were in a meeting with investors for a major acquisition. A deal that, if it had gone through, would have shut down a small orphanage in Chicago. You might not have known, but that orphanage was my home." Damien's breath hitched. His mind reeled, trying to recall such an event. His company had acquired many businesses over the years. Some deals had been aggressive, but they had never deliberately displaced children. Had they? Seeing the conflict in his expression, Arya continued, "That day, you stood up and walked out of that deal. You refused to sign off on the acquisition. Your decision saved the orphanage. Saved me." Damien's chest tightened. He had no memory of this. I don't remember." Arya gave a small, bittersweet smile. "You wouldn't. To you, it was probably just another business decision." Damien felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. He wasn't a man prone to sentimentality, but there was something about Arya's words that shook him to his core. He had spent years making hard decisions, believing his actions were always calculated and logical. But had he really made a choice that had unknowingly saved someone's life? "You're sure it was me?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Arya nodded. "I was 16 at the time. Too young to understand corporate negotiations, but old enough to know what was at stake. The orphanage director, Ms. Calloway, told us the place was going to be sold, that we'd all be separated. I remember feeling helpless, terrified." She hesitated before adding, "And then one day, she came in crying happy tears. She said that someone had backed out of the deal, that it had saved us. That someone was you." Storm outside continued to rage, but Damien barely heard it now. His mind was drowning in a storm of its own. He had made so many deals, broken so many, and walked away from countless negotiations. Yet this one, the one that had apparently altered Arya's fate, had slipped from his memory entirely. "I don't understand," he murmured. "If this meant so much to you, why didn't you ever try to reach out to me before now?" Arya let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "And say what?" "Hey, remember me? The girl whose home you saved on a whim." "No, Damien, that's not how life works." He frowned. "Then why tell me now?" Her gaze flickered toward the window, the reflection of lightning flashing in her eyes. "Because fate put us in the same place again. And because I need to know something." "What?" Arya hesitated, gripping the stem of her wine glass as though steadying herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why did you walk away from that deal?" Damien blinked. It was a simple question, one he should have been able to answer easily. But the truth was, he didn't remember. He had been a different man back then, ambitious, ruthless. Walking away from an acquisition didn't make sense. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if it meant saving you and the others, I'd like to think I had a good reason." Arya studied him for a long time, as if trying to gauge whether she believed him. Then, slowly, her expression softened. "I've spent years wondering if you even knew what you did," she said. "If you had any idea that one decision changed everything for me." Damien exhaled, something inside him unraveling. "And what happened after? What did you do with the life I unknowingly gave you?" A small smile touched her lips. "I worked. I fought. I studied. I got scholarships and built a life for myself. I became a lawyer, actually." He raised an eyebrow, impressed. A lawyer. She nodded. I help non-profits now. I fight for the people who don't have a voice. For the first time in a long while, Damien felt something stir in him. Pride? Admiration? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that this woman, this stranger-turned-mystery, had just shaken something loose inside him. Before he could respond, a sudden power outage plunged the room into darkness. Arya gasped, and Damien instinctively reached for her, their hands colliding in the pitch-black room. His grip tightened around hers. "It's okay," he said. "It's just the storm." But as the thunder rumbled and their fingers remained entwined, Damien couldn't help but feel that something much bigger than the storm had brought them together that night. The darkness in the room lingered, punctuated only by the flashes of lightning outside. Arya's fingers remained in Damien's grasp, her touch warm, grounding. For a moment, they just stood there, the storm raging around them, yet inside the suite, an unusual stillness settled. Damien, a man who had spent his entire life chasing power, wealth, and control, suddenly felt like none of it mattered as much as this moment. He had built an empire, made ruthless decisions, and had always been certain of his path. Yet, here was Arya, a living testament to the fact that even a single moment of kindness, one he couldn't even remember, had created ripples that had changed a life forever. She had become a lawyer, a fighter for the defenseless, a force for good. And he had become a man obsessed with winning at any cost. "Arya," he said finally, his voice almost lost in the storm, "you asked why I walked away from that deal." She nodded in the darkness, waiting. "I don't remember that day, not the details, not the exact reason why I did it," he admitted. "But tonight, meeting you, seeing what you've done with your life, it makes me wish I had remembered. Maybe I wasn't the man I thought I was back then." Arya squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe you were always more than just a businessman, Damien. Maybe, deep down, you just forgot." For the first time in years, Damien felt something break inside him, an old version of himself, a hollow shell of the man he had been, crumbling away. The lights flickered back on, casting a warm glow around the room. Arya slowly pulled her hand away, giving him a soft smile. "This storm will pass soon," she said, glancing at the window. "And by morning, we'll go back to our lives." Damien studied her, realizing he didn't want to go back to his life, not the way it had been before tonight. "It doesn't have to be just one night," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe fate brought us together for a reason. Maybe we're meant to rewrite the next chapter together." Arya's eyes searched his, uncertainty flickering within them before something gentler replaced it. "Maybe," she whispered. Outside, the storm began to quiet, the rain softening, the thunder rolling further into the distance. And inside that room, something new was beginning. An unexpected, unplanned connection between two strangers who, it turned out, were never really strangers at all. The end.